All right, so today we're going to look at preparing for emergencies, and mostly I'm going to be talking about what we would do if a child was injured, and then online you're going to spend more time with kind of the emergency preparedness policies or how you would prepare ahead of time. So community care licensing has many regulations for our preparedness. And there's also an amazing step-by-step guide from the University of California, San Francisco, who also did the safety checklist that we learned about in a previous week. And every program should have policies and response procedures in place to follow in the event of an illness, serious emergency, active shooter, because your own program, depending on your location, the amount of children you serve, and the ages that you serve are going to have different kind of requirements. So some schools might be on a different campus, they might be at a workplace, they might be next to a busy road, and then the type of emergency that you might have policies for. So are you going to have fire, active shooter, earthquake? All three of those are going to be really different. And then the age group, babies typically have to be put into cribs that are mobile and can be pushed around and moved, or that is the easiest way to do it. And so you don't really think about it until you have to. The most I ever had to evacuate was like 175 children because of a suspected gas leak. And that included children 6 weeks old to 7 years old. And that was quite an ordeal to get everybody out and to a community center across the road as we had the firefighters kind of figure out what was going on. It turned out to be kind of like this is on Pendleton, it turned out to be kind of like, as the firefighter said, swamp gas. So it was kind of like a buildup of gases in kind of some kind of sanitation line or something like that, and that was causing the smell. But at the time, it was very scary and we had to get everybody out. So having those procedures in place and then having had staff who's familiar with them and knew how they had to be implemented, me, myself, as kind of the program administrator, and then also the staff knew what to do as far as every classroom as well. So each staff member should be trained in basic first aid and CPR. Typically the licensing requirement has just a few people on staff. There always has to be at least one, but I think that everybody should have it. It should be a requirement, and most places have it. You have to have it currently, and that's really important. We need to have first aid supplies that should be available and accessible, both in the classroom and then in the front desk or kind of common area as well, and making sure that those are well stocked, and making sure that if it's not, that you order them as well. And that was typically an admin assistant job, would be like every 6 months, to make sure that all of the classrooms and our larger kind of evacuation kits or shelter in place kits had available supplies as well. And then we have to inform our family. So typically when they enroll, or if you change it or make any large changes to it, you inform the parents by having them sign that they've been informed, and then they get a copy of your emergency response policies and procedures as well. So how do we respond? And I'm going to go over what happens if a child gets hurt, and then online you guys are going to explore more policies and procedures. So the basic principle is to remain with the child at all times. And I had a child who had severe epilepsy, and she had to go with the paramedics a couple of times, and I would always send a teacher with her because we were taking care of her at a child care center. Her parents weren't there when she hit her head from epilepsy, and she had to go with the paramedics. So I would always send a teacher with her. Same with, we had a child break his leg by tripping. And we sent a teacher with him, and he actually had to go off. He had to go pretty far away. So we sent a teacher, and then I followed in my car as well. We shouldn't move them unless there's a danger of further injury. So if the child especially hurt their neck or their spine, we would leave them where they were, unless like it was in the middle of, unless it was like they were going to be electrocuted or something like more death or danger would happen, which typically is not a big deal. I mean, even if it was in the middle of a road, you could always divert cars around it as well. And we don't want to move people and wait for the really trained professionals, physicians and doctors or nurses. Don't give fluids or medications unless prescribed. So if the person on 911 tells you to give fluids, you don't need to worry about it, or medications unless it has been prescribed. So we had a child, once again, who had really severe epilepsy, and she had a specialty medicine that we had all been trained in how to administer it to her because her epilepsy was so severe. Otherwise, we were just to have her be in a safe spot where she wouldn't be hitting her head and allow the seizure to go. We always need to call for medical assistance. That's always the first thing that you should be doing, and it's so much easier than it used to be. I mean, back in the day, I remember running and running to get to a front desk, and now we have cell phones wherever we go. I remember being in one of my first jobs, being on a field out with a bunch of children. It was a school-age program, and I was really young, and somebody dislocated their shoulder, and this was before cell phones were all over the place. And I remember running like a half a mile in order to get to like kind of the main desk in order to kind of call for help as well, and have a more adult than I was at 17 or 18 come and help as well. And then we always need to notify the child's family. So we've called 911 where we're administering the appropriate CPR and first aid, mostly waiting for the actual professionals to come, but we always need to notify the child's family so that they can either go to the emergency room and meet the child there, or come to the center and evaluate the child themselves. We also need to record all the information: what happened before, what happened during, what kind of first aid you gave to the child when you called 911, what the parents did as well. Because in the moment, you don't remember. In the moment, you're very much adrenaline, and you might start to forget those types of things, and you need to have written record, because you're most likely, with licensing, going to have to file an incident report if something happened during the course of your education business. So you're going to have to call licensing and make a report. So you're going to want to have that written down. And then also when they come out, you want to have an accurate kind of record of what happened. And also when you're notifying the child's parents, you want to have all that information as well. So if a child has become hurt because of anything, any kind of emergency, you need to assess the child and the environment. Once again, making sure that nothing worse would happen in that environment, like death or getting electrocuted. We need to assess the child. What do we think is going on? We need to alert another adult and call for the professionals, call 911. We need to attend to the victim and provide appropriate treatment, such as CPR, rescue breathing, Heimlich maneuver. We need to record all observations and treatments. And then we never want to attempt to diagnose or give medical advice. So we would never tell the parents, oh, I think he's diabetic, unless you happen to be a doctor who is also a child care worker. But even in that case, you're not working in your doctor profession, you're working in child care. So we wouldn't do that as well. So if a child is not breathing, we need to check the victim for response and injuries. So we need to establish that the victim is not breathing. So we need to check to make sure that they're breathing, that we can, or maybe for their pulse as well. And then why we think those injuries have happened. We need to start chest compressions, airway and breathing, which you've probably, that CAB or CAB, you have remembered from your endless CPR and first aid. And then you need to give chest compressions. I always say that wrong. You need to open the airway, and you need to continue doing this until the victim starts breathing or medical assistance arrives, or you can take turns with somebody else if you are starting to get tired yourself. The Heimlich maneuver, or a kind of airway obstruction, is to dislodge an item from the child's airway. So that's why we don't typically do grapes or hot dogs, popcorn, all of those high choking probability foods, because we don't want to have children choking on us or having their airway obstructed. So it's really different for infants, toddlers, and older children or adults. So typically with younger children, it's a back blow, and so you tilt the child down and you strike with the heel of your hand on their back as a back blow. And this typically dislodges it. I had an infant choke one time or have their airway obstructed, and I had to do this, and it was the scariest moment of my life, but we got the Cheerios or whatever it was that he had in his airway out. And then with other children, you might have to do a chest thrust if they are old enough as well. A lot of times children can go into shock, which can be life-threatening and occurs with different types of injuries. I went into shock when I broke my nose. We were sledding and I ran into a tree on my sled, and I broke my nose on the tree and I went into shock. So I was going unconscious. My eyes were rolling back in my head. And so it was super like pale, my mom said, and I was just kind of like laying around, and they rushed me in the car to the emergency room, and I seemed super confused about why we were going. And I was like, let's go sledding again. I don't want to leave, even though I'm like bleeding from my nose. It's totally broken. And I'm just like, I want to sled. My parents didn't do this. They did not follow safety protocols. They did not have me lie down or elevate my feet, or closely observe my breathing, because they were up in the mountains. This was the 80s. There was no cell phones. They couldn't call for 911. So they shoved me in the car. I sat on my mom's lap, and we rushed to the hospital. And then in the hospital, I got chickenpox. And then my dad said, this vacation sucks, and we went home. Asthma attack. I obviously have asthma. I'm sure I've talked about it a lot. I've had a rough year with my asthma for sure. And I've had to be on a daily steroid, which I don't always have to do. But this year, my the swelling and narrowing of my air passages has been really bad. And so this is the picture right up here. It should be fairly open so that you can breathe and you can get air into your lungs. But if it starts to narrow and become like inflamed and congested, you can cough a lot, you can wheeze, which you can really hear in somebody's chest, and it becomes life-threatening because, you know, oxygen is pretty necessary for human survival. So asthma rates for children under 5 years have increased a lot. We think this is about air quality. So especially in Southern California, where I have a lot of smog, air pollution, we have a lot of industry, we have the naval yards, things like that. So we see higher rates of asthma with children who are from poorer backgrounds and live closer to industry, things like that. So the South Bay has a lot more area, Chula Vista National City, because they live by those shipping yards, which are known to create kind of air pollutants. Boys are typically diagnosed more than girls, especially if they're living in low-income families because of the environments that they live in. And then 5 to 17 years of age, combined 11 million school days annually due to asthma as well. And it's also very much like the cold, bad weather, smog, things like that, fires, anything like that can really, really kind of make your asthma worse. Encourage the child to relax, which is almost impossible as somebody who's had many asthma attacks in their life. It's very, very scary to stop breathing, or to not be getting oxygen and to feel that you are not breathing. So being able to relax is an important thing, but it's almost impossible to do when you're having a really serious attack. So typically you want to have the other children in the classroom go away or not be crowding that child, which will make that more stressful. And then they need to have their prescribed medications. Most children, I mean, I've seen 2-year-olds know how to do their inhaler, their albuterol inhaler, which kind of helps the airway breathing. But you might have to help the child if they're getting to the point where they really can't do it for themselves. You need to monitor their breathing by sitting down next to them, making sure that their breathing rate goes back to normal. It's not so fast. Hopefully the coughing and wheezing will stop. And then you always need to call for medical assistance if it's prolonged, the child's struggling to breathe, or they become fatigued, which are typically what we see in an asthma attack as well. And then obviously tell the children's parents. So bleeding, children are going to bleed all of the time. That's just, children fall. But if it comes in spurts or cannot be controlled, so it's not stopping or it's like spurting out because of an artery, you have to call 911 all of the time. You should have universal infection control, so you have gloves on, so you might even need face coverings, anything like that. And then you're going to need to clean up using universal infection control, but you don't need to worry about that in the moment about cleaning up. Afterwards, though, you need to make sure that you are keeping bloodborne pathogens at bay by protecting yourself, the child, and other people as well. You should apply direct pressure and elevate as possible. So if it was a leg or an arm, they could keep their arm up like this with direct pressure to make sure that they're not losing blood. Notify the child's parents as well. Then diabetes. So more children are being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes because of obesity, and younger children are being diagnosed as well. Type 1 does not have anything to do with obesity, but it definitely is quite common for children as well. And it's the leading cause, it's the seventh leading cause of death, and predisposes children to heart disease, stroke, and kidney. So diabetes is increasing within Black communities, Latino communities, American Indian or Native American, Asians, Native Hawaiians, and other Pacific Islanders. They think this is because they're no longer following their indigenous or traditional ways of eating and living and using more of a processed kind of standard American diet. And so we want people to return to more fresh fruits and vegetables and less processed foods. But we also need to know that in diabetes, there's hypoglycemia and hyperglycemia. So making sure that if the child is insulin dependent or needs insulin, you can recognize those signs, help the child monitor their blood sugar rates, and appropriately give them the medication that they might need. This is typically something that you will be trained from by the family or even from a nurse as well, so that you know what the child's own signs are for hypoglycemia, hyperglycemia. Are they acting disoriented? They can even pass out. You can even go you can even go into a coma from this as well. So it's typically something that you need a lot of training from in order to do. And then head injury. So anytime a child hits their heads, we've learned a lot more about concussions because of NFL players and things like that. So anytime you hit your head, we should consider it potentially serious and call the parents right away. Typically, if it has been diagnosed as a head injury or concussion, they will be out for a week to 2 weeks to 3 weeks. They typically can't be on iPads or any types of screens because they need their brain to just kind of rest and relax. So we need to carefully observe the child though. And then there's training that you can do from the CDC for head injuries and concussions. And it takes about 15 minutes. I had to do it because my daughter was in Little League and it was really, really great. And I will post it online for you guys because I think it's really important for everybody to know what the signs of concussions are, especially for sports, because most children will play sports. Then teachers should also know how to help just kind of injuries. So scrapes and cuts, and how do you put on Band-Aids? When do you wear gloves? Bites, because there's ants, there's mosquitoes, anything like that as well. Blisters are super common as children have their new shoes or their shoes are a little bit too tight. And then eye and nose injuries are really, really common. Less so eye, but more toddlers sticking Play-Doh, beads, anything like that up their nose. Typically, you can plug the other nostril and have the child blow it out. If they're struggling with that, you just need to call the parents, and they're going to have to take their child into urgent care, where they'll get the very long tweezers and they will pull it out. And that probably happens quite a lot as our toddlers are learning that you shouldn't put things up your nose, which is an important life skill. All right, guys, I will see you online.